Welcome to the second in our colloquium, second speaker in our colloquium on inequality, human rights, and labor. And as many of you know, it's part of a classroom, a class as well, and there are students now this time, usually they're confined to certain tables so that you can pick them out. But I see that they're spread around on the various tables, and then it looks like there are a lot of other folks here too as well, so we really appreciate it. There's information in the back about other events we have in the series, and I'll just say that on Thursday we have another talk which is also about human rights, inequality, and labor by Ai-jen Poo, and the material is back there as well. But we're all here and present and very excited for Judy Fudge's lecture. Judy is going to speak on modern slavery, unfree labor, and migrants' rights. She came to us from London, as I already mentioned. She's a professor of law at Kent Law School. She works on labor and employment law transnationally, as well as in Canada, where she is originally from and taught for many years, Europe and the EU and the UK, and including, she's been telling us a little bit about learning about the post-Brexit UK law and how it's developing, in case anyone wants to ask her about that. Judy is remarkably prolific, so I could spend her entire 2 hours reading out articles she has written on many, many topics. But instead, I'm going to let you look that up and read them all, and our class is going to continue to read some work by her. And for our talk today, she's putting together two pieces that she shared with us that are part of a forthcoming book entitled Modern Slavery, Labor Exploitation, and Unfree Labor. And the two pieces, as you will hear soon and the students know, one is on the new UK Immigration Act and the other on the Modern Slavery Act. Judy will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then after that we will have the pleasure of hearing from Sharmila Rudrappa, who came to us all the way from Sociology and brought a couple of colleagues, and really we appreciate that. So Sharmila is professor of sociology and is also director of the Center for Asian American Studies here at UT. She too works on a variety of issues, mostly involving gender, race, and labor. And I should say, well, her specific interests now, although we might even hear about some more, if not today, another time. Her most recent, so some of her interests are on reproductive markets, with a focus on US and India. And her most recent book, I think, is Discounted Life. Is that still from 2015? Discounted Life, The Price of Global Surrogacy in India. So please join me in, oh, let me just say one other thing. So after Judy speaks, and then Sharmila will give response for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. And the students in the class I'll call on first for a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the group. So thank you for being here, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would really like to thank Karen for the kind invitation and warm hospitality. I've eaten a lot of very good tacos. They're kind of different than what I eat when I'm in the UK, so that's nice. I'd like to thank Kate for all of her help and the members of the class earlier on today for an interesting conversation. And of course, Sarah Klein for helping me get here and organizing all of this. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Rapoport Center, and I want to thank Karen for reacquainting me with some literature that's relevant for the work that I'm doing, which is the critical legal work, both the initial stuff from the turn of the century and from the turn of the last century, and the stuff today. So it's really helpful to find another literature to engage with. And it's also a real pleasure and opportunity to be able to present a work in progress. As I tell my family, you know, if you don't tour, you don't sell the articles. And usually you're always selling the one that you've finished and you don't really think about anymore. So to be talking about something where you can actually help me work it out is really a pleasure. So I look forward to it, and I'm really looking forward to Sharmila's comments, because it's rare that someone actually gives you comments, so that's great. So I'm really interested. I moved to the United Kingdom. I'm a migrant. I'm a Canadian. I'm on a visa in the UK. So that might make me hypersensitive to the way migrants are constructed there. And I work in the intersection now of labor and migration law. And what I became really interested is the rise of a discourse around modern slavery. Modern slavery was used to discuss almost anything that was bad. And then a crime of modern slavery was introduced. And modern slavery is a portmanteau term which covers old slavery, treating people like property. That was abolished in the 1926 Treaty Against Slavery. It includes human trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation, forced labor, and domestic servitude. And it was hot in the United Kingdom since 2007. In 2007, modern slavery became the major way of referring to human trafficking for the purposes of exploitation, labor exploitation, or sexual exploitation. And it coincided with the UK's major celebration of the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade within the British Empire. And that was a really significant moment. In the United Kingdom, the discourse of modern slavery emerged and flourished in a context in which the government announced its commitment to making the UK a hostile environment to illegal migrants. Migrants who did not have documentation either to reside in the United Kingdom or who could reside in the United Kingdom but who were restricted in what they could work. Right? Then advocacy groups started using modern slavery to describe certain kinds of visa conditionalities, visas that allowed you not to work for anyone else other than the person who'd sponsored you. I was profoundly uncomfortable with this advocacy effort to stretch the meaning of modern slavery and human trafficking to people on tied visas, since I was on a tied visa and as a university professor did not feel I was particularly a slave, yet the Romanian free mover under European Union law was considered perfectly free. So I was very puzzled by this. And I was also really concerned about why we would hitch a labor and human rights concern to a criminal law endeavor, which I was worried would backfire and heighten immigration controls and criminal punishments rather than protect working people with rights. So in this context, the United Kingdom introduced the Modern Slavery Act in 2015, which it heralds as being the world-leading instrument in the battle against slavery, which benefits or befits a country that was the world's largest slave trader. In the 18th century, the British Empire was supported by slavery, and industrial capitalism came to Britain because of slavery. But there is almost no public acknowledgement of that fact. And in 1833, when the United Kingdom abolished slavery, they paid slave owners huge reparations, the highest transfer of public money to private hands. So how could the UK be a world leader around modern slavery, tackling it, and never admit to its past. So there's the Modern Slavery Act that comes in, and in 2016 is the Immigration Act, which is probably one of the most repressive pieces of legislation for tackling the problem of illegal working. That is people who are migrants, but who do not have the authorization to do either any form of work or certain forms of work. And this was seen also, the Immigration Act, as a way of tackling modern slavery. So in this context, it seemed ripe to write a book on modern slavery, labor exploitation, and unfree labor. And what I'm interested in is the social dynamics of legal characterization. Why do we think certain kinds of behaviors are modern slavery? And why do we use labor law or criminal law or human rights law or immigration law to tackle them? Because all of these different areas of law have their own technologies of legal governance. We all know that in crime, you get due process. You have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. You have police. In labor law, it's a balance of probabilities. You have inspectors. Human rights, it's different. So the deployment of different legal technologies is very important for seeing how we conceive it. And then once we deploy a particular jurisdiction of law, criminal law, immigration law, human rights law, they become path dependent. They become embedded in our kind of governance structure. And then we start constituting our social world in those terms. So I'm interested in seeing how law both is a product of social and political forces, but in turn helps to create those social and political forces. And looking at modern slavery and the Immigration Act seems to be the way to go ahead. So today what I'm going to focus on is the Immigration Act of 2016, because everyone seems to focus on what's happening in the US around undocumented migrants. But what's happening in the UK is actually quite shocking in terms of what's happening, but little reported about, somehow naturalized and not seen as problematic. So I'm interested in the relationship between immigration law and criminal law, and what this means for the government's attempt to tackle the problem of labor exploitation. My argument is that if you hitch your concern about labor rights to a bill that is concerned about immigration and tackling illegal working, then your undocumented worker, your illegal worker, their human rights become subordinated. And we don't ignore their rights, and they function in a different kind of way. So if you look at the two quotations from the Minister of Immigration, you will see that when they introduced the Immigration Act, so it went into Parliament in 2015 and eventually came out as the legislation in 2016, right from the beginning, the idea was that illegal workers hurt British workers. Right? And that if we want to deal with labor exploitation, we should fight illegal workers. They are the problem. Now, the Immigration Act 2016 is a really interesting law. It's assembled of carceral, criminal elements, and labor regulatory elements, all within an Immigration Act. On the one hand, it makes illegal working a crime. So someone who doesn't have immigration authorization, who does certain kinds of work that they're not authorized to do is a criminal. And you can seize their wages, you can put them in jail, and you can deport them. And employers who employ them are also criminals and can be put in jail. So that's the carceral element. But also part of the Immigration Act 2016 is all of this material about regulating the UK labor market. It establishes a director of labor market enforcement. It expands the remit of this thing called a Gangmasters Labor Abuse Authority. Gangmaster is an old English term that refers to a labor broker or labor contractor. And gangmasters are used in the agricultural sector, the horticultural sector, and food processing. And they're very exploitative. So there was a whole system for regulating them when 23 undocumented Chinese workers were drowned picking cockles. So this law was introduced. And it only applied to certain industries, but it was expanded throughout the labor market. And new regulations, new instruments for tackling labor abuse. So what I was trying to puzzle out was, why is this really coercive around illegal working and employers of illegal workers, and then has all of this pro-labor stuff? So the questions I initially thought about were, how has illegal working risen to prominence as a policy problem in the United Kingdom? What's the data about it? How did this become a huge issue of concern? And then how did illegal working and labor standards enforcement come to be linked? Now, the temptation is to do what we mostly do, take the government at its word, that it's tackling labor exploitation, and then show how the law backfires. That by criminalizing illegal working, you make migrants much more vulnerable to abuse. And everyone will tell you that will inevitably happen. It just does. So that's not that hard of a strategy. And it's also being very positivistic. The government means what it says. That seemed too easy, and lots of people were doing it. So I wanted to think, what's actually going on? How does this crime of illegal working, especially in a labor standards enforcement regime, what work does it do? So I want to go beyond a positivist account, seeing what the government says it does, and try and figure out how it functions. And I'm interested in thinking about, what is the significance of the connection between making illegal working a crime and strengthening labor market enforcement for understanding the UK government's framing of labor exploitation and its approach to labor market regulation? What does it tell us about what it thinks is labor abuse in the labor market and how labor markets should be regulated? And my methodology was mostly to look at documentary analysis, background papers, newspaper reports, speeches, and I even used software to do it, which is very trying for a lawyer to do things in a rigorous kind of discourse analysis, but I did, I coded. And the structure of my argument is in two parts. The first part is the theoretical frame, and one is a pretty traditional political economy of immigration. The second is a kind of understanding how illegal migration functions in a particular political context. And then the case study really is in two parts. The first is to show the UK government's increasing hostility towards illegal migration, and then a detailed analysis of the 2016 Act. And luckily, you're not in the class, nor Sharmila, so you don't have to go through all the detail. I'll give you the high points. Okay. So this is my question. What is the work that illegal working performs in the UK government's governance strategy. And here I draw on Nicholas DiGenova's work. And many people talk about his work in terms of deportability or illegality. But what I'm more interested in is, what does illegal working do? What's its productive capacity? Not how do we use the law to repress illegal migrants, but what kinds of things does it produce for us? And here I think the figure of the illegal migrant plays a particularly profound role. And I'm interested to see how it features in the labor law context. And here, oh, sadly, it's a bit out of order, I apologize. But I'm interested in seeing how the productive power it is, how we understand the illegal migrant in particular context, because how it functions here in the US is quite different. There's no Mexico beside, right? They're not worried about the French hordes coming over anymore. That's over, right? So that's not what they're concerned about. So what's going on in the UK? It's not like right beside the UK is another low-wage country. That's not happening. So what is the illegal migrant to people in the UK, and how does it function in our labor law context? So I use DiGenova's work, but to that I want to add a notion of liminal legality. Immigration law. I'm kind of new to immigration law. I've only been working on it for about the past 10 years. It's so complex. It changes all the time. It's mostly guidelines. You look, it changes, you look, it changes. What's the status? Who knows? I thought labor law was bad. So you put immigration and labor law together, and it's hard to tell. If Kate teaches yoga, she's an illegal worker in the UK, right? So if international students work more than 20 hours in a week, they're illegal workers. If the university professor who's a Canadian on a visa goes from Kent to Edinburgh and works without a new sponsor, they're an illegal worker. It's really complex. So where we draw the line between illegality and legality is mostly known after the fact. I can't tell you exactly where the line is. So it's this liminal area. And this liminal area is really important because I think it links to how we understand law's legitimacy. Law tends to come pre-legitimated in a way, because it comes with liberal values and a democratic provenance. But we all know that certain laws are highly contested and their legitimacy is borderline. And how we make laws legitimate when they're contested has to do with how the media circulates them, how advocacy groups respond, how governments respond. So liminal legality is that space in which enforcement and media can respond to changes in the political context and challenges to legitimacy. That's my argument. Okay. So the UK has an incredibly deregulated labor market. It makes the US look highly regulated. There is no national enforcer of labor standards. There isn't. Mostly you enforce your labor rights through individual litigation, and you have to pay fees to do so. Tax enforces minimum wage. And there's only 2 other publicly enforced standards. The rest, it's all up for grabs. No Department of Labor hours and wages division. They don't have that there. So it's almost completely deregulated except for individual litigation. And that's really important to understand. And it has weak standards that are poorly enforced. Most labor laws in the UK, other than minimum wage and the trade union law, are all dependent upon the European Union. And once the UK leaves the European Union, there is no requirement for them to have hours of work law, holiday law, pregnancy leave law, none of that. So it's highly deregulated labor market, individual enforcement. The political economy of immigration is also really interesting. The UK has no low-skilled, and low-skilled doesn't have to do anything with the skills that people have. Low-skilled, it has to do with national designations and what the host receiving country recognizes, right? So it's a formal attribution by the receiving country. So the UK has no low-skilled temporary migration because it's part of the European Union. There's 28 member states. There's Romania, there's Bulgaria, which joined in 2006 and came to circulate in 2010. And the wage differentials between Bulgaria and Luxembourg are bigger than the wage differentials between American states and many Mexican states. And you can travel from Bulgaria to the United Kingdom without a visa because it's one of the 4 freedoms within the European Union. In 2004, when 8 low-wage countries joined, all former Soviet countries, the Baltic regions, and Central and Eastern Europe, Britain, Sweden, and Ireland said, there's no transition. You can all just come in. And there was a huge flood of migrants to Britain, many low-skilled, because it's a highly deregulated labor market, no work-to-welfare regime, so you can collect unemployment insurance without having to look for a job, right? And a high pound, and that's critical. The pound was really high. The pound's no longer high, and all the migrants have left. Go figure. So you have this incredibly open immigration regime and no labor enforcement. So in that context, what do we think of putting illegal working to political work? In 2010, the coalition government, a coalition of conservatives led by David Cameron and Liberal Democrats, was elected. Okay? And Theresa May, who is now Prime Minister, was the Home Secretary. The Home Office is like a mega department of Justice and the Attorney General. So it's like a super department of Justice and the Attorney General. And in 2010, David Cameron, who's Prime Minister, and Theresa May, who was his Home Secretary, said that they were going to make a hostile environment for illegal workers. That was their goal. And Cameron said that it was a question of fairness to make it hostile for illegal workers. Fairness to the British people, but also fairness to those who have been shipped over here against their will, kept as slaves, and forced to work in horrendous conditions. So making it hard to get a job as an illegal migrant was good for slaves and good for British citizens. Wow, that's really amazing, right? Right? And the Home Office also identified another beneficiary of making a hostile environment for illegal working. Compliant employers, good, decent employers who hired people with visas and paid the minimum wage and adhered to labor law. They were being exploited by illegal workers and those exploitative criminal gangs who were using them. Right? So in 2014, the government made employing illegal workers a crime. And what we see between 2015 and 2016 is the emergence through the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 and the Immigration Act of 2016, 3 tropes and 2 causal claims. The first is there's the poor slave and the illegal slave driver, and the Modern Slavery Act will root them out. And then there's the illegal worker and the unscrupulous employer who's a criminal gang. In the Immigration Act 2016, will weed them out. And then there's the innocents, the British citizen worker and the compliant employer. And the problem is that illegal working leads to criminal exploitation and is the result of criminal exploitation. So if we stamp out illegal working, we can stamp out this exploitation. And labor exploitation hurts the poor slave, the British worker, and the decent employer. And these, my coding showed it just all came together. These are the things, the vans. Are you in the UK illegally van? You were supposed to see this, feel unbelievably bad, and like take yourself off to wherever you came from. So all driving around the UK was all these white vans with these panels. Are you an illegal worker? Go home. Okay. So the Immigration Act was going through Parliament at the same time as the Modern Slavery Act, and it got bogged down because it was quite extreme, and it was introduced in 2016. And what it was an attempt by the Cameron government to deal with a very neoliberal labor market. There has not been wage gains in the UK since 2008. There's a high percentage of low-wage working. And there's a real problem of enforcing your labor rights. So it's a neoliberal social market, and the government's clawed back on welfare entitlements. Right? So what finding the illegal migrant does is it resolves the problem. It's not us. Like, we're not mean. The problem is the illegal migrant. You know, if we give a lot of social benefits, it's an invitation for people to come. Right? So illegal working was inextricably linked by the government to enforcing labor standards and enforcing the labor market. So the primary purpose was to make illegal working a crime. And there were two prongs. One was to make this broad crime of illegal working. And working means everything from classical employment to selling goods to working in the informal economy. That is all a crime, right? Employers who had been engaged in criminal activity, if they employed illegal workers, the mens rea, the mental element, was lessened for the crime of illegal working, right? And there were new enforcement tools. The government could shut down businesses that employed illegal workers. And what you see here is a kind of liminal legality. Because if employers actually help border officials detect illegal workers, they don't go to jail. They don't have to pay fines. So if you help, so if you say, oh, yeah, I have illegal workers. Yes, I have employed them, but I will call a meeting and you can come and raid them, and then you get off. So that's a kind of liminal legality. What was clearly illegal behavior becomes, if you're helpful, a form of accepted behavior. Illegal migrants, if they have reason to believe they're illegal, then they will be guilty of the crime, but the government is not as lenient. There are no mitigation guidances for that. The second purpose of the act is to enforce labor law. And if you look through the enforcement proceedings and the background papers, it's clear that the business department, which is what they call labor there, was about ensuring that employers hired legal workers because they were unscrupulous And that meant that the good employers wouldn't have to be covered by as much regulation. So if we use criminal law to target, then we don't have to deregulate the labor market. The Home Office was concerned with prosecuting organized criminals, but said, you know, yeah, there are vulnerable workers, but we have the Modern Slavery Act to deal with them. So we don't have to have liminal legality for illegal workers, because if they're slaves, we'll treat them through reparation orders. So I'm going to just move forward. So the challenge is, how can you resolve this light touch regulation with criminal coercion? And the government recognizes that that's almost impossible to do. So what they've done is appoint an academic to be the director of labor market enforcement. And he has to resolve these competing tensions. Although his resolution, right, how much enforcement effort should be sent to the criminal law, how much working with immigration officials should there be, how much should we have a proactive labor standards enforcement, all of his strategy has to be approved both by business, light touch regulation, deregulated labor market, and Home Office use criminal law to get immigrants. And I think there's some open questions about where the situation will go, because there's choices. But I think that the key to understanding the choices is the political context. David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister after the UK decided to leave the European Union, because he supported staying in the European Union. So he resigned and was filmed whistling as he walked away after his chaos. Right? When he resigned, Theresa May, the Home Secretary, who is behind the Immigration Act 2016 and the Modern Slavery Act, she became the Prime Minister. She thought she could win a stronger majority. She had a majority from the 2015 election. She thought she could consolidate it in 2016. So she held an election. She didn't win a majority. She only had a minority. And she has to deal with Brexit. So the question is, will the Conservative Party become more labor rights? But this is really the wild card. You probably saw a lot of Nigel Farage during your election, because he was one of the big supporters of Donald Trump. He's the head of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. And this is one of the posters, ads he released during Brexit. See all these people? All those not very English-looking men? Those are the hordes who would enter Britain if Britain continued in the European Union. So Nigel Farage, the breaking point. We must leave the United Kingdom. We must leave the European Union if we're going to maintain our political integrity. The Conservative Party has moved to UKIP to outflank UKIP. So immigration is the major fault line of politics. Right? And the government is really busy with Brexit. So it says it's going to have a labor market enforcement strategy. It's given it to an academic to deal with it. But it's clear that its primary concern is with immigration. So what can we conclude? I think that in order to understand the political work that making illegal working a crime performs in the UK government's labor market strategy is to put it in the overlapping context of a febrile anti-migrant discourse in the UK and a deregulated labor market. If you want to keep people out of your labor market, you regulate it. Sweden, really open immigration, lots of temporary migrants, really regulated labor market. Hardly anyone goes there. Employers can't exploit workers. It's totally regulated, 70% union membership. Right? By treating the problem of labor exploitation as inextricably linked to that of illegal working, the Immigration Act 2016 is part of an attempt by the Conservative government to say, we're good to the working people. Don't vote for Jeremy Corbyn. We love you. We're not the problems. It's not the problems with our bad labor law. It's the problems with those illegal workers. They're your problem, not us. Trust us. We'll be good to you. At the same time, it moralizes and criminalizes labor exploitation. It's criminal gangs. It's slave drivers. It's not a structure of a light touch labor market regulation where there's low union density and no national inspectorate or enforcement. That's not the problem. And then by appointing poor Sir David Metcalf as the Director of Labor Market Enforcement, who has to come up with a strategy of enforcing labor law when there is no enforcement agency, they've allowed him to bear the brunt of all the failures, although they control the agenda because his reports have to be approved. So they can distance themselves from any failures of labor market strategy because, of course, the academic is taking the So I think that we have to understand illegal working in a way to understand Brexit and very low labor market regulation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy. That was a lovely paper. Thoroughly enjoyed reading it and also listening to you deliver it. So I'm going to keep my comments a little bit shorter than 10 minutes. There's a whole bunch of stuff I've written in the interest of time, because I know you have to leave in about an hour's time. What is interesting at some level is how different the UK looks in terms of how it deals with immigrants versus the US. In the US, the migrant really is a figure of suspicion because he, and it's generally a he in the way it's popularly understood, is a criminal, a terrorist or a criminal, right? And so therefore, Donald Trump talks about building that wall to keep, to keep drugs and criminality back in Mexico and not allowing it to cross over. And even though there is some concern about immigrants taking away our jobs, the concern really in the US is much more about criminal activity, right? It's interesting then that in England, that the worker himself, it sounds like, because so much of it is about agricultural labor, which I would imagine tends to employ men much more than women. The criminal here is the masculine immigrant worker, right? So what is interesting for me is to think through how these two processes look so different, right? So if in the US it's trade agreements such as NAFTA and jobs leaving the borders that is most worrisome, in England, in UK it seems to be it's these immigrants coming into coming into the country. I basically wanted to jump to the questions that I had, and I guess these were at some level questions for clarification, rather than thinking through in terms of, a critique as such, but if you could expand a bit more, right? First, how extensive is illegal work in the US, right? Illegal working, I guess I should say. And by the way, I've really loved how you've talked about illegal working rather than an illegal worker or illegal work. So the act of working with a particular kind of status is what is making it illegal. I really like the way you use the term illegal working. First then, the question is, how extensive is illegal working in the UK? And where are these workers who are engaging in illegal working coming from, right? I love that image that you had of Fudge with all those ostensibly South Asian-looking men with all their mustaches and brown skin, which is certainly not the Romanians and the Bulgarians, right? So that was the first question I had. The other question is this, right? In the US today, 2 wage earners are needed to maintain middle-class family status, a middle-class status, right? So more and more women are entering the formal labor force in the US. And as more women enter the labor force, more and more child care and elder care is outsourced to immigrant women who are sometimes working illegally. I'm not going to say all the time, right? But quite often, especially here in Texas. Now, the costs that, now what these women do is at some level they subsidize the wages that companies have to pay to their workers, and it also facilitates women's labor market participation as well. How does this play out in the UK, right? You've talked about agricultural workers. I'm wondering whether you could speak a little bit more about gender divisions of so-called illegal working. You'd spoken a little bit when we talked earlier about nail salons being cracked down on. And I'm also wondering who owns these nail salons, because there's been this whole scandal in the US as well, with Vietnamese American-owned nail salons being the most egregious labor law, violators. Is there a way by which this is not just about gender, but in terms of enforcement, how race plays into it as well? Who is doing illegal work? Is that a brown body, brown or black body? And is it also a feminine body, right? Think through that. Also that modern slave. So much of trafficking anxiety in the US is really about that helpless woman, right? How does that play out in the UK context? Related to that, what kinds of low-wage jobs do migrants perform, right? What kinds of work is actually going on? Is it just agricultural work? Is it also the service economy? And what kinds, right, is there? So that was a related question to the second question. My third comment, I really love the term you use to describe the complex nexus between immigration controls and employment conditions, right? You use the term legal liminality, building from Genova. I'm wondering if you could also think about high-skilled work, or what I prefer to call high-wage work, as also liminal, right? So it's not just that workers are liminal, but the work itself, from being high-wage, moves into low wages. So you can call it as, I'm thinking about IT workers, right? At one point in time, information technology workers, software workers were seen as high-skilled. But precisely because of the kind of person who does this sort of work, an immigrant worker here in the US on a temporary basis, the work itself starts garnering lower wages, but it also gets seen as lower skilled work, right? Those Indian software workers are really not as high skilled as us Americans, right? And Americans here always codes for white. So I'm wondering if you could also at some level tell me think through whether high wage work itself is liminal. So it's not simply about migrant citizen status of the worker, but also the kind of activity they perform can move from high-skilled into being understood as low-skilled. And I'm going to put low-skilled in quotation marks because anyone who does work in an agricultural field or even try to grow a garden realize it takes a lot of skills to grow those darn plants, right? So it's not low skills whatsoever. It's low wages. So what I'm asking at some level is to think about work itself is not fixed, but is ambiguous, changing meaning, where changing notions of skill levels are involved, and thus changing wage compensation based on race and gender, right? To think through that. And then finally, what I especially found really interesting, and we spoke about this a little bit this morning, was this term slavery that gets bandied about, especially being in the US, right? To think about any kind of indentured system of labor as slavery, given this country's own complex, messy history with slavery, it's really interesting to think about how the UK uses slavery and whether there's been any sort of backlash against that. And if you could speak a little bit more, because I would be, even within the Indian context, knowing Indian labor activists, even in India, we talk about indentured labor and debt peonage. We do not talk about slavery, right? So it's fascinating that within the UK context, there's this, modern slavery act, which I think is fascinating. So I'm wondering if you could just, speak about these to give more body to your paper. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Those are really helpful questions. Most bad jobs in the United Kingdom are done by people who are perfectly entitled to do them. There are people in the European Union who have free mobility rights. Unlike NAFTA, where there's no free mobility of people, there's limited stuff around intercorporate transfers. In the European Union, there's mobility of workers. So there's hardly any illegal workers within the United Kingdom, because there's people who might be visa overstayers, right, holiday makers. There might be family reunification, or there might be students who are working more than 20 hours a week. But there's not a big problem, and in fact, there's absolutely no data on it. There's a 2005 study that says there's not a lot. There's another 2012 study that looks at the 2005 study, but the popular press has reported that there's actually a lot of illegal working out there because they've had people say that there is and that the government's hiding it. But there's no evidence of huge problems around illegal working because you have a huge supply of perfectly legal people coming from Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Right? So it's not a huge problem. Modern slavery, and you have to understand, in the UK, and it was shocking for me as a Canadian to think, in Britain, they think that they liberated the slaves. That's their understanding. They don't think they were the biggest slave traders in the 18th century and that the empire was built. They don't think about it like that. They think Wilberforce led to the 1807 Act that abolished the slave trade within the British Empire, and then later they got around to dealing with the problem in 1833. They don't mention the Jamaican Rebellion. They never mention Haiti. So they're liberators. So for them, modern slavery became the term introduced by the Blair Labour government in 2007 because of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. There is no definition of modern slavery in the Modern Slavery Act. And as a lawyer, you think that's a bit weird. What the Act does is it refers to Article 4 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And Article 4 has a term that says forced labor, domestic servitude. Those terms aren't defined in the European Convention of Human Rights. They are interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights, the court that Theresa May no longer wants to be bound by. But this is her act. She's the person who's behind the legislation. And for someone who wants out of the European Convention of Human Rights, you'd wonder why she had the key definition dependent upon a judgment of a court that she despises. The other part of the definition of modern slavery is a reference to human trafficking. So there is no definition. In terms of the gender division, the UK has a really strong breadwinner model. I'm still shocked. You can be dam, lady, sir, lord, viscount, reverend, miss, and Mrs., but never Ms. That's the one thing you can't be in the UK is Ms. You can have any other title. They have a breadwinner model. It's only now starting to move to a dual earner model. Highest proportion of part-time work for women outside of the Netherlands, where men also work part-time. So childcare is done by grandmothers. And you can share by law your parental leave with your mother. Right? Because you're not going to have your husband doing it. Right? So there is no large issue around domestic work. The domestic workers who come to the UK come with high value, people with lots of money, migrants. And if you're a high-value migrant or a high-value expat returning to Britain, you can bring in a migrant domestic worker for 6 months. Then she has to leave, and then you can pick up a Romanian. So, but London is a high-income capital, and there's 18,000 visas for these domestic workers who come with high value, right? So mostly it's, so that also has to do, the vision of the poor slave in the UK is the Filipino domestic worker who's being brutalized by the Arab. That's it. The way they detect slaves is people at UK border services go, oh my Lord, have people, are you a slave, are you a slave, are you a slave? And what they've actually discovered is that 20% of the people who they think are illegal migrants or slaves are actually British citizens. They've forgotten that Britain was an empire and for a while let the Commonwealth come and get citizenship. This also has to do with who they see as illegal workers. Illegal workers tend to be cannabis farms, very worried about cannabis farms, Vietnamese, nail salons, Vietnamese, takeaway shops, curry shops, domestic workers, right? Filipina, Nigerians. So it's a completely racialized enforcement. And it's mostly, you don't have to be an immigrant to be a slave, but the people who identify slaves are the border services. So if you're looking for slaves at the border, you're more likely to find migrants. So that's, I hope those have answered your question around liminality of work. That's why I think of it as liminal illegality. If I'm on a tier 2 high-skilled visa and I'm employed as a university lecturer, then I'm doing the right thing. But what happens if I stop being a university lecturer? I'm still paid as a university lecturer, but I'm doing more IT work. Or I'm put on garden leave, which they call in the UK, where you're on a kind of disciplinary suspension with pay. Which you wonder, why is that a punishment? Thought it's called a vacation, I think. So there is a liminality. The liminality is around work as well as it is around migration status. So thank you, those are really helpful questions. Okay.
Do you want to stay up there?
Sure, sure. Because I'm going to be sitting for 12 hours.
You stole one of my questions, so I'll turn this to but you had 4 I'd never heard of. I mean, I haven't heard of. We need do we? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if you have a question, Kate will bring you a microphone.
We need it for the recording, right? Okay. Who's up?
So folks in the class. Let's say.
Well, Well, first off, thank you for coming.
Thanks.
I think that from both the papers and the presentation, you kind of push the argument behind this idea of illegal working as kind of furthering the government's particular policy goals. And so I'm kind of curious about, within the parliamentary drafting process of law, what was the sort of feedback that was provided on the law from, I guess, civil society or human rights or even the EU? Because I'm really hoping you're not the only person that kind of figured out that there was kind of a more negative side to the use of the term illegal working and how the law was framed. And so I'm wondering if there was a sort of a pushback or feedback or commentary from other political actors that kind of attempted to prevent it, or whether it's become a norm in the UK.
That's a really excellent question. Thank you. So the advocacy groups, the NGOs, are kind of split. So there's the migrants' rights groups, the focus on labor exploitation groups. Their argument is that by making this crime of illegal working, you're making undocumented workers more vulnerable to exploitation. And it violates International Labor Organization conventions. It violates some of the EU positions, the sanctions directive from the European Union. So that's one group of advocacy groups. Then there's a kind of other group of advocacy groups who are interested in the slave, but they're not interested in the migrant unless the migrant is a slave. So there's a whole bunch of advocacy groups that are anti-migration in the UK as well. So civil society is both. So Migrant Watch is an advocacy group, and they don't like migrants. Right? So it's divided. The Labour Party, although it had, in 2008, said British jobs for British workers, and Gordon Brown had a very anti-migrant approach. The Labour Party voted against the illegal working crime, although the Labour Party agrees that labour migration should be reduced, but they would like to see the labour market regulated and no particular crime. So that's a really good thing. So it really kind of splits around, so the kind of Conservative Party from Northern Ireland, it supports illegal working. The Conservative Party supports illegal working. UKIP supports illegal working. And the other parties, the Green Party, the Labour Party, and the Liberal Democrats think that this is a violation of civil liberties. But it's split. What other country might be like that? Good question.
At the end of your article on the Modern Slavery Act 2015, you advocate, I guess, a pivot from the criminal law jurisdiction to the labor law jurisdiction as a way to address these issues of exploitation. Do you view the remedies offered under labor law as sufficient or merely a starting point? And will we need to take an approach, social dynamics of legal characterization approach to things like private property or citizenship in order to further close this gap?
David wrote a very nice commentary on one of my articles, so thank you for those questions. I've got a bit of a flag up on them. So that's a really nice approach. When I started teaching labor law in the UK, I could not believe how unregulated the labor market. If you have statutes that you can't enforce except if you pay a fee to enforce them, what's going on here? So it seems to me what you have to do is regulate a labor market as the first step, but it's not a solution. The question of how you deal with immigration is a big question. The United Kingdom is the only advanced industrial country that counts international students as migrants in its migration figures. Why would you do that? Most countries in the world are competing to get international students. No country other than the UK counts international students as migrants. So stopping counting counting international students as migrants would drop it from 100,000 migrants a year down to 50,000 migrants a year. So you would have the number of migrants just through counting changes. I do think open borders, which had been the case for 28 members in the European Union, it causes problems, but mostly it works. But now that the UK has opted out over the issue of labor mobility rights, that's going to create a huge crisis. So I don't know if you can actually, how much we can liberalize immigration law in the current context. Remember, it's a post-fiscal crisis context where people's standard of livings have dropped, where it's true we're not in the same problems that we were, but people are starting to become over-indebted again. So property law, tax law is, I think, absolutely huge. But I don't think tax law is moving in a way that makes it more redistributive. I think it's going in the opposite direction. So I think you're right that labor law won't solve all the problems, but it'll certainly solve a lot of the problems of my students who aren't getting minimum wage and have no one to enforce their claims.
Listening to you, first of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It's an excellent lecture. I'm curious to know, it sounds like leading up to Brexit that the electorate had sort of bought into some of these ideas, which you describe as baseless, right? Like about in terms of numbers on illegal working.
Yeah.
Since Brexit, at least in America, there's been this perception that there is a noticeable regret and sort of some people's decisions to vote for Brexit. Has that attitude towards some of these issues, like illegal working, have they sort of sobered up? Is it in the States, you know, there have been people who have sort of initially were very pro some of the policies and now started to realize this is not working out how I thought it would work out. Or maybe I was wrong about that. So I guess I'm curious just to sort of...
No, that's a really, really interesting question. Like, I would never have migrated to the United Kingdom if I knew they were going to leave the European Union. I moved to England because it was a bigger place than Canada because it had Europe and I could work with other colleagues. And for me, it's absolutely shocking that I'm now in this narrow little island. It's true that there is some regret, but you have to understand the voting. Where there are lots of migrants, people don't hate migrants. They're just their neighbors. Where there are hardly any migrants, people hate migrants. So cities, London, overwhelmingly stay in the European Union. Big cities stay in the European Union. Scotland, stay in the European Union. Northern Ireland, keep us in the European Union because we don't have the troubles anymore and we don't want a border. So it's poorer areas, areas where there aren't a lot of migrants. And the problem with the EU vote, the referendum vote, young people didn't vote. Older people voted. And there's a cognitive bias. Like, I don't mind that Thaler got the Nobel Prize because I think behavioral economics helps us to understand certain things. There's a cognitive bias when you get older. You think it was better earlier, before it was better, because you were better, you were younger, you had hopes, you had dreams, you were flexible. It makes complete sense. So what you think was, it was better then, but really, I was better then. Right? I had more dreams, I had opportunities. People who are older tend to vote in a nostalgic way. Back, you know, when we could have baked beans rather than curry. Right? Although curry has replaced fish and chips as the national dish in England. Right? So young people didn't vote. And it's a very strange referendum. There was nothing about the consequences of what would happen. So when people say Brexit means Brexit, you go, well, what does that mean? There was never any consequences. There was never any quorum. There was never any protocol. So there is some regret. But there's also a whole bunch of people saying, we got through the Second World War. We can get through anything. And I said, well, you know, Hitler was invading. I mean, this is self-inflicted. So they believe that they will be able to strike a deal with India, with the United States. Theresa May came and visited Trump, the first head of state to visit Trump. So they think they can be better on they had an empire. They don't need the European Union. So there is some fear by some people, but the people who firmly voted Brexit still support Brexit. The people who didn't vote wish they had. But the Labour Party is hugely divided. Jeremy Corbyn does not like Europe. Right? So if we had a strong alternative in a political party, there would be some hope. But that's not the Labour Party's position. Their position is, we voted, we're leaving. We don't know on what terms, but we're leaving.
So I think maybe I'll follow up on one of Sharmila's questions, and well, actually, and also Matt's question, and then we can open it up. But the students should also raise your hands, and if folks will just, in general, try to catch my eye, I'll stand up to look for you. But I just wanted to ask you, Judy, because I think so. On the question of how many people are working illegally, what it was one of my questions too. And just as you keep talking about the dynamics and the politics around Brexit, it seems to me that the elephant in the room, right, was sort of who different people imagined the threat to be. And I mean, you did a beautiful job of starting off and putting this in the EU context, and the folks who are both maybe the threat but also the saviors, so a threat generally, but the saviors for the flexible market are actually the Bulgarians and the Romanians and others from within the EU. So I don't know enough about what was being said between the introduction of the bill in 2015 and the moment it got enacted in 2016, how that tracked onto the Brexit story and discourse. But I wonder if you could say something about that, and also what's happened since the Brexit vote in terms of when people talk about immigrants. I don't know if you've had a chance to follow that discourse. Are they talking about migrants from within the EU who might soon be working? The decision has to be made, right? Are they going to be working legally or illegally? And I mean, a moment ago you sort of suggested, oh, okay, now we're going to have more flexible immigration, maybe labor market more rigidity, but it was, we're going to have to, the UK is going to have to respond to that on one hand. On the other hand, it seems that there's going to continue to be a strong push for keeping the same model. So anyway, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts about that, but I thought just it might be a way to bring us
back to the
back
political
into the,
economy.
well, and in this moment and thinking what it might look like going forward.
So it's really unclear who the threat was. It's clear that people voted to leave the European Union, those who did, for two reasons. We want sovereignty. We don't want those bureaucrats in Brussels telling us what to do. And as I point out to my labor law students, those bureaucrats in Brussels gave you 30 paid holiday days a year and paid maternity leave and hours of work regulation, which you have never had in this country. They didn't know that. Okay. So that was a sovereignty issue. There was also an issue that migrants were taking their jobs. But that had been fueled by David Cameron, who in 2012, in a speech, said, "Welfare and migration are two sides of the same coin. We have too high benefits for lazy British people. And because of our high benefits, we bring all of these migrants in. So for David Cameron, he wasn't really anti-migrant. He was anti-British people who didn't work. So he used migrants as a cudgel to go after social benefits, and he made restrictions on social benefits. Then when people said, you're restricting our entitlement for social benefits, he said, the migrants made me do it. He'd been saying that migrants come in because British people are lazy, so I have to tighten the welfare. Then when migrants came in, he said, I had to tighten the welfare because migrants take it. He said completely contradictory things, and no one seemed to care. People can hold completely contradictory things. You can hate migrants and love your next door neighbor who's a migrant. Completely, perfectly compatible lived experience. So he set the tension up. Then it got out of hand and Nigel came. And Nigel, he doesn't like Europeans, although he was a member of the European Parliament for 10 years. But it's not really the Poles and the Bulgarians. It's asylum seekers. This is Syrians at the border of Turkey. It has nothing to do with the UK. And the UK hasn't accepted any asylum seekers. They agreed to accept 300 children from Calais and have only accepted 25. So when you probe people who said they didn't like migration and that's why they voted against staying in the European Union, there was anti-Polish sentiment, but most of the sentiment was against people from the Gulf, Northern Africa, and South Asia, not people from Europe. So it was a way of going back to, let's remember Britain when we ruled an empire and they were over there where they should be and not here. But it was all mixed. And you have to understand, I come from Canada. We are a kind of placid country. We don't have a Fox News. We don't have a Murdoch press. We have a very adenine press. People, you know, we call our major newscaster Pastor Mansfield. He's so glad. We don't like a vicious press. The UK, wow. Wow. These things circulate all the time in the press and the popular imagery. The Daily Mail, the Sunday Sun. The Daily Mail is online. It's the most watched news. And for them, the migrant is the Polish plumber, right, who undercuts the good British plumber, but it's the Syrian refugee, the Bangladeshi garment worker, the people who won't say Merry Christmas and don't support the Queen. So it's all roiled up in these politics. Right? And pulling each strand. You know, I was having a debate with an academic friend, as you were saying, migrants lower wages for the working population. I said, well, you know, this is something I spend a lot of time studying, and I can show it has this kind of impact in a deregulated labor market at the bottom end jobs. And she said, but migrants lower wages. And I said, well, give me some evidence. Didn't matter. She's an academic. How do you deal with these things? So maybe what we have to be is not academic and say, what's the evidence? What is it that worries you? Be more of a psychotherapist. It's not evidence-based, it's fear-based. What is it that's upsetting you about this? Why do you feel so anxious about this? So I'm going to become now a therapist in my classes, I guess.
We can open it up more broadly.
Nicholas had a question.
Oh.
Yeah. Thanks, very interesting. When I was reading your paper, I stumbled upon this formulation of that employees have to be very careful when they're employing people because they can be charged if there's reasonable doubt. And I was wondering if there's like repercussions for legal migrants who work on a visa basis, that they get less employed because of the I don't know, forged documentation or something like that, and that is, if that is considered by the lawmakers.
That's a really important thing. So in the United Kingdom since 2014, landlords should check your passport before they rent to you. It's a crime to rent to an undocumented migrant. It's a crime to drive in the United Kingdom if you're an undocumented migrant. And employers have to check, and they have to make actual due diligence. Okay? The consequence of all of these things, the Home Office got my visa wrong twice. And then the third time they got it right. So the Home Office, who issues visas, couldn't get my visa right. But my landlord is supposed to get it right. My employer and the people who I rent cars from are supposed to all get it right. So what do? Most people can't check a visa. They don't know how to do it. So they go, you got an accent. Well, European citizens can work in the UK. But there's been real problems of discrimination, which is illegal under the Equalities Act, to discriminate on the basis of nationality and ethnicity. Proxies. You have an accent, you have the wrong skin color. So it's clear that the right to rent, to show a documentation, led to a lot of denial of rental properties to people who were British citizens, but they happen to be of African descent or South Asian descent. So it's having huge consequences in that kind of way. And it's illegal to discriminate on those bases, but those are the proxies that we use. Right? So I can usually get by, because mostly they think I'm an American, right? But, you know, the last time I was at the doctor's, they wanted to see my visa. I pay taxes, and I pay a special health tax. So if it's happening to people like me, who are university professors from Canada with a name like Fudge, which is English, I can imagine what is happening to lots of people. So it's a really good question. So it's fomenting a lot of discrimination.
So, just to be clear, it's open to anyone who wants to ask a question now, or make a comment.
Yes, thanks for a very good lecture.
Thanks, Francis.
The idea of, you began the lecture by saying that there's this over concern of trying to relate criminal labor laws to criminal law. And in most countries, we have things like fines for people who work without work permits. and they are sometimes or usually enforced through criminal law. So where do you think the line can be drawn when policymakers, like the government, are trying to address these issues? I don't think you want to see several acts being passed for just everything. There are times when you have to fuse them. So how do you view this? Where do you draw the line in fusing criminal law, labor, migration together to make sure that somehow there is some enforcement for some wrongdoing within labor and migration?
That's an absolutely great question. So if you think of the labor market, and I'm going to channel a neoclassical economist for a moment, you think, okay, there's supply and there's demand. So supply would be the people in the country and migrants, and they could be illegal or legal, right? Documented or undocumented. And also you have demand, right? So what firms want. If you have high labor standards, right, then you have really two options to high labor standards in a highly regulated labor market. It's not just high standards, but enforced standards. You will either have skill your workers up so you can get really good productivity for them, or you will invest in capital and automate so you can avoid the labor costs. The UK has had the lowest productivity of almost any country in the past 6 years, any country in the European Union. It got beaten out by France. Do you know how upsetting that is in England? And that's because it's an unregulated labor market, and you can bring in supplies of cheap labor, often undocumented. So it seems to me that how you can stop it is not really the supply. There's more than enough sad, poor people in the world who will risk their lives for a better life, and it's never going to end. And that's how countries like America and Canada were founded, in people doing that. And you're never going to stop it. People will always seek a better life, and they will do whatever they can to make a life better. So you will never stop supply. You can build walls as high as you can. There will always be higher ladders. What you can do is stop demand. So you have to regulate the labor market and force employers to invest in labor or invest in capital. And that's the only way you can do it. So criminalizing it will never work, because you can put people in jail, but they might be killed or they'll die or be bombed in their countries. So it's always demand side. It's never supply side. So that would be my basic rule on this. You can't kill the supply. You have to deal with the demand. So you have to deal with your labor market.
So Nora and Lorette and Sharmila has a little left. That'll probably get us close.
So this is kind of in response to the last question. I just had like a follow-up with respect to like the supply never ending, because you know conditions are always going to be worse, or the assumption being conditions will always be worse in countries that are being bombed and things like that. Does that then require like an analysis of like national security and things like that to be incorporated into like this analysis? Because you know a lot of these people that are fleeing to the UK are fleeing, or at least in the US context, a lot of people who are fleeing to the US are fleeing from like US violence in their countries. And so is that ever like discussed and put into the context?
I think very few migrants are kind of like me, who thought, Canada's great, really nice, really like it, kind of boring. Let's go for more challenges. I don't think that's mostly why people do it, have a great job and go, wow, I want to see the world. I think you're kind of a perverse person to do things like that, right? So I recognize I'm perverse around these things. Most people are doing it to They're going through hardship. They miss their families. Okay? They're making a better life, more opportunities. Clearly, structural inequality is a problem. Wars lead to huge migration flows. Environmental devastation leads to huge migration flows. Having policies that promote environmental devastation and war will lead to more migrants. So, again, how you deal with it. Migration is really just a symptom of a problem. And then you use the symptom to obfuscate where the problems are in your own country. So it becomes this never-ending thing. And none of it's easy. Like, I don't think any of it's easy. If it were easy, we'd all work it out. And I don't think that people who disagree with me are evil. I think it's actually complex. And I don't know how you work out some of these things. But misidentifying the problem means that you will actually never find a solution. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, there wouldn't be a problem with Syrian refugees if we weren't bombing Syria. Right? So the whole knock-on effect from the first Gulf War is just coming home to roost. But we dealt with it at the end of the Second World War, which was a huge migration. Countries like Canada and the United States took millions of displaced people and integrated them into their economies. But we've somehow lost the generosity of spirit?
Sure. Thank you again for being here today.
Thanks.
One of my questions was sort of in thinking of the solution if we're moving away from criminalization of undocumented workers, where does human rights fit into all of this?
Yeah.
And if we're talking about ways to regulate labor or capital and using labor law to address that, if Theresa May doesn't want to use European Court of Human Rights precedent, you know, are these courts, are these human rights mechanisms really good tools to shape more equitable labor laws in the UK, or are they not as useful, and what's your opinion on that?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you so much. It's really interesting. So the Convention Against Forced Labor is an ILO convention dating to 1930. And its solution to the problem of forced labor, which is a human rights violation, is to use criminal law. Article 4 of the European Convention of Human Rights says that forced labor is a violation of a fundamental right, and it also uses criminal law remedies. When human rights gets hooked to a criminal law agenda, you have huge problems, because we all know if you are a plaintiff seeking to vindicate a human right where the only remedy is through the criminal process, you've got proof beyond reasonable doubt. It's lengthy, it's consuming, it's difficult. So I would like to see human rights go much more in a regulatory mechanism, so that we had agencies like inspectorates, the EEOC, right? That's a regulatory approach to human rights rather than a criminal law. So I would like labor law and human rights to get together, bring immigration law along with it, and say criminal law, just go away for a little while, because it's a simple solution. Make a crime. That's not a solution. And I have debates with my friends. They say, you know, they do occupational health and safety, and they say killing and maiming at work should be a crime. And I want to go, well, even people I don't like, I don't want to put to jail. I just don't see the social utility of it. Does it make people feel better? Yes, unless it's someone they care for. You know. So, I know, I hate to say it, I'm sort of not into the criminal law. I don't think it works very well, and I think it's really expensive.
Judy, I had a question. It seems that in the Q&A, it's much more not about illegal workers, but it's really about race. And I'm wondering if you could actually, how the paper would look if you reframed illegal worker or illegal working as something done by the Syrians, the South Asians, because the illegal worker and the illegal
Yeah.
working is really a racialized body.
Yes.
And maybe the paper is really not about illegal working, but it's about race, no?
I think the first round through, it's about illegal working and the function that it has within the governmentality structure around the labor market. And then I think the second run through of it is around notions of sovereignty. And sovereignty really isn't about Britain's relationship to the European Union. It's really about Britain's self-understanding of itself. And that's, I think, where race comes in. So I've really focused in that paper around the labor governmentality strand of it. I also do think there's a national sovereignty and sense of self strand of it. I think countries are always in a process of reconfiguring themselves. You know, part of the reason when I moved to the United Kingdom, in Canada we had this prime minister called Harper. He wanted to make it illegal for women to wear veils in public. He wanted to make it harder to become a Canadian citizen. He didn't like refugees. He was, even my father, who's 88 and a former oil company businessman, said to me, "I'm embarrassed about being a Canadian. We're supposed to be decent." He didn't like the reconfiguration. He wanted us to be more like Swedes and Norwegians rather than. So I think countries are in a constant. So for a period of time when Britain was doing very well, when the financial bubble was bubbling up, cosmopolitanism was chic and in. But in this new austerity world, we need strong headmistresses who will slap us. And Theresa May's the perfect slapper. She's a whacker, right? She's not like your therapist, how's it going? She's your whack. So I think the second, that would be something that I would talk about, but I think because it's hitched so much to a labor market agenda, when you put labor law reform into an immigration bill, it's going to make people suspicious. It just is. But I think that's the second take on it, is who is the figure of the illegal worker? So it has a function within the labor market strategy, but it's the sad Filipina slave. It's the sad Vietnamese nail. It's the bad Lithuanian slave driver. It's the horrible traveler, which is the British term for gypsies. And if you look at all of the people who've been prosecuted for modern slavery, travelers, Lithuanians. So I think that's the second run I would have at it, that I would refigure it and try and pick that out by looking through the national offense records and things like that. But I think that's a really insightful way of doing it.
So I'll ask the last question. But I will say that Sharmila and I've been sitting here writing, saying both. It seems to be about race. So I want to follow up a little bit, and then I want to attach it to the liminal legality part. So we were writing notes, sorry. And it's because I think both in terms of who was imagined to be, who was the threat, right, in the Brexit vote, and then what are some of the effects of the category illegal work. in response to both of those questions, race was the answer. And it was also about people of color who are British citizens who are presumed not to be because they don't have the nice last names like Fudge. So you raised it a couple of times. So then I wanted to maybe, if you would stick, I mean, you can still refute that, but it seems to me that however you label it, it's going to come into play in the liminal legality.
Yes.
But I had a question about the liminality, because when you've described it a few different ways. So at one point you said, oh, the law is never clear, you can't tell exactly who's working illegally, who's not, so lack of clarity seemed to be the problem. And I guess I kind of thought, well, we can make it, you could choose to make it more clear than unclear. There will always be the ambiguity, but how ambiguous, how much room there is to play in the actual law could differ. And the way I thought you talked about it in the paper, and maybe in the second run in the talk, you talked about it as the lack of, well, that it would come into play at the enforcement level. And I think that the second is what you're more interested in and committed to.
Yes.
And I suppose it's too early to know how exactly that will play out. But it seems to me that that could certainly, that maybe part of your response to Nicholas suggested that some of the ways in which that could play out would be around not even who gets accused, convicted of illegal working and which of the workers, but some of those secondary effects of who doesn't get a lot of benefits because they're presumed to be working illegally.
No, I think thank you. I really think that's a very good point. And I've been talking to the Director of Labor Market Enforcement quite a lot and commiserating with his difficult job. And I said, you have to be very careful. You can easily target Vietnamese nail bars. You can target South Asian takeaways. You can target all of these on the basis of racial and ethnic and national characteristics. But you're actually only going after really small players. And illegal car washes, hand car washes. That will give you good press, but it will do nothing for the labor market. And you have to make a choice. And if you do that kind of stuff, people like me are going to raise the question, is this this has a disproportionate impact on the basis of race. And you're going to have to tough it out when we do that, because there are real choices. And we will see how he decides around his enforcement strategy and whether he can release an enforcement strategy that Parliament doesn't approve. So I think the test will be, I think it's mostly driven by how many hits you can get in a newspaper. It's kind of the pornography of slavery. The sadder the sack, the worse it is. But that doesn't deal with the structural problem. The structural problem is supply chains. And going after the Lithuanian who brings in other Lithuanians doesn't deal with the problem. You have to go after the supermarket chains. But the supermarket chains want profit and they want low prices because wages are low. So then you've got a big problem. But those are structural problems. So I think you have to put it bluntly to these people. If you go after low-hanging fruit, ethnic enclaves in the labor market, you will get lots of hits, but you will not deal with the structural problem. So are you going to be a political hack, or are you going to be committed to enforcing labor market regulation and make it clear that people have to decide and put it clearly out there? And it's really uncomfortable. Sir David's a nice guy, even though he's a sir. And it's uncomfortable to have to say this to someone in a meeting. You're going to be judged on what you do. And no one likes to raise this. You know, you're having tea. So those are the inhibitions, but those are social inhibitions we have about raising these issues, aren't they? But I think that's where we'll see. But those are great questions. Thank you so much. I really learned a lot.